the war in the Ukraine has been going on for 3 years now, and in those 3 years, about 100,000 Russians have died, and I think around 70,000 Ukrainians have died. So that's the real number. Of course, the President of the United States will say millions, and I think that I think everyone expected the war to be over by now, but uh, but let's talk about the future. I think it's pretty clear that many believe that the war is going to end soon, and I believe that it could last for it's probably going to double the length. Well, not, but the war going on for another 3 years. I think that is a likely possibility, and that's very clear. Negotiations. People think that, the problem isn't that Ukraine hasn't been negotiating, so they haven't come up with a deal, and as soon as they negotiate, they're going to come up with a deal with Russia, and it's going to be peace, and people just think that Ukraine's not willing to fight for very long. But, of course, Russia gave an ultimatum after they invaded, which is a terrible idea. Normally, ultimatums go before the invasion, and the idea is if you accept the ultimatum, we won't invade. But this ultimatum that Russia called Minsk Free, or should be, or more accurately, a peace deal, involved handing over the Donbass and Crimea and recognizing Crimea as Russian. It also meant the Ukraine would accept a federal system, and I'm sure it would have banned Sabota or and got rid of the far right paramilitaries, and of course protected the Russian language, banned the Ukraine from joining NATO and all that stuff. Of course, I believe the Ukraine should have accepted this deal. Of course, I think anyone else. But if they weren't going to accept that before 70,000 people have died, well, then they're not going to accept something that's even worse. So, I think the Ukraine, if they, for example, the North Tyreva or whatever I'm going to call it, that the Ukraine should not accept losing that, and I think they want Russia to hand back the parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson they occupy. Of course, Russia wants the entirety of Zaporizhia and Kherson. So I think it's all just a bit ridiculous. Russia's claiming that, and honestly, I'm not going to say that. Complete change of opinion. But, yeah, I'm completely against that. Of course, Russia invaded because Ukraine is oppressing the Russian language speakers in the Ukraine, and I think that the peace deal must protect Russian language speakers. I think the Ukraine being mean to Russians in the Ukraine is one of the big reasons why the war started. And of course, I'm sure Ukrainian speakers in Russia will not be treated well. So I think, well, here's the thing. This war could have been avoided if the Ukrainian government, Russian government, would make a deal saying that the Ukraine, that Russia will support and help Ukrainian-speaking communities in Russia, and Russia would support Russian-speaking communities in the Ukraine. I don't get this hostility. But maybe the peace deal, I think the peace deal should have a population transfer deal, because the wars, I think it's destroyed the relations between Russia and the Ukraine for the long term. So the pro-Russians in the Ukraine can go to the occupied territories, and those in Russian territories who are more pro-Ukrainian can move to Ukraine. So, yeah, I think that would be a good deal. Of course, many will not want to go. But, yeah, so now with the military talk, I'm going to talk about the military. The Russia is advancing, but the Ukraine seems to be holding the lines, of course. This was years ago right now, but people saying that the Ukraine should adopt defense in depth. Well, it's been 3 years, so if the Ukraine had adopted a defense in depth, the Russians may have made it to Dnipro or close to that one. The truth is, Ukraine can't afford to lose that territory, so have to sacrifice lives defending land. They have plenty of manpower, and I think a good example is the Iran-Iraq war. The population of Iraq compared to Iran is very similar to the population of the Ukraine compared to Russia. And of course, we all know how that war ended. It ended the same way as it started. Nothing changed. So if Iraq can stop Iran conquering it, then and return the border to what it was before the war, then the Ukraine can also do that with its population. So population isn't a problem, and as we've seen, Russia has lost about 30,000 more soldiers, which is irrelevant because Russia's got a lot more. But of course, the Ukraine can use conscripts, but Russia is using contract soldiers. So Russia also has manpower problems. And what we're seeing is Russia has had large stockpiles of armored vehicles and stuff, and less so for Ukraine. So Russia can afford to lose more in assaults. So yes, Russia will make gains and the Ukraine will take casualties, but Russian and the Ukrainian casualties are both sustainable. So both sides can afford to fight this war for a long time. So, but if the Ukraine starts sacrificing lots of territories to save manpower, which they can afford to lose, to inflict more losses on Russia, who can afford to lose those increased Russia, then effectively all what's happened is the Ukraine gets a better KD ratio, which is impressive to all the people that play video games, but they're sacrificing land and Russia is actually closer to victory, and of course that shortens the war, and each square kilometer Russia gets is a square kilometer that the Ukraine would have to get back in negotiations, which won't happen. So I think what the Ukraine army is doing is what they have to do to prolong the war, because the Ukraine needs this war to go on for as long as possible. And of course, the Ukraine can devote their entire society to fighting the war, but Russia, they can't do that. So eventually, the Russians will want an end to this war because they want it to peace and stuff. Of course, causing economic problems, but the question is who will give up first. And the Ukraine, what they need to do is they need to not give up first. Of course, I think the truth is, I think the best solution, the best result the Ukrainians can realistically get is that deal Russia offered initially, but without the federal system, which I like federalism, but they keep the far right, which I think is also good. But ultimately, what has the Ukraine got for all these 3 years of war? Not much. What has Russia got? Not much. And I think it will be remembered as, how do I put this? As a massive waste of life. And of course, the Ukraine, if there's territory transport, then the Ukraine's never going to get that land back in 100 years or so. So I think this border will be permanent, but at the end of peace. So yes, those 100,000, 200,000 Russian lives will be lost, but they'll get more land, and that land will pretty much stay Russian forever. So, yes. So I think it's really philosophical situation. For America, for the American perspective, a country which can't even lose, which will be brought to its knees if 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 volunteers die, if it will bring America down to its knees. They're looking at that as America has a history of fighting for territory that isn't their territory, it's other countries. So they're saying, oh, why hundreds of thousands of people dying? Oh, the war needs to stop. Just give up the Donbass, just give up that. But meanwhile, the Russians and the Ukrainians, they're not so anti-dying. They're not so weak as the Americans, so they can absorb those lost territory. Of course, it will still be devastating, but still, it won't. But that devastation will be real, not just psychological, not just like what I'm talking. But they can afford to lose it. But what will do is it will change the order permanently, and it'll stay like that for centuries, because the nation is like a body, and America, they're too scared to get a bruise. Meanwhile, the Russians and Ukrainians, they're losing like fingers or stuff. If the Ukraine loses the Donbass, that's like losing a hand. So it's like losing a hand in exchange for not being beaten up. Of course, the Ukraine will take that beating to try and save as much fingers as it can. So, yeah, don't have much more to say except 3 years of war, and here's to another 3 years. And that is all. Stop the war. This war is unnecessary, and that's my opinion, and that is all.